Hello, and welcome to What's the Story, a short podcast from Light Reading exploring the biggest topics impacting the telecom industry, where we dive into one main story to tell you the latest news, why it matters, and what to expect next. I'm Nicole Ferraro, your host and an editor at Light Reading, and I am here with one of my esteemed colleagues, the great Iain Morris. Wave to your fans, Iain. There you go. So today we're going to be discussing Iain's recent reporting on Intel, which has confirmed plans to spin off and sell for parts its network and edge business, which is something that was previously rumored. We're going to get into the implications of all of this, but just to start out, I was hoping if you could just summarize the main news of this decision, how long it's been rumored to happen, and what details have actually been confirmed by Intel so far.
Yeah, hi Nicole. Yeah, good to chat about this because it's a big topic. It's quite a long running one. I think the rumours. I mean, I first started to get wind of this last year, and there was also some reporting going on by Reuters. And it's probably not surprising. I mean, it's no secret in the bigger kind of computer industry that Intel's in a bit of trouble at the moment. They're kind of getting pursued, I guess, by rivals on multiple fronts. They're sort of perceived to kind of drop the ball in AI really, and Nvidia is the really big threat. I think there's this kind of feeling there's a transition going on from the sort of CPU world that Intel's been into to spending on GPUs, and that's affecting money that would once have flowed into Intel's products. There's concerns about the challenge from ARM, which is a kind of rival architecture to x86, the Intel architecture. For a long time, it was very much a kind of smartphone game, but these days we hear about ARM talked about in the data center. And I'm using a laptop now for this call that's got an ARM processor in it, obviously with Apple sort of taking that decision. So, and then they've kind of pushed quite heavily into this foundry business, which is the other challenge. This sort of very costly plan to become a sort of contract chip maker. And obviously that's not cheap. You're setting up fabs, you're investing a lot in capital expenditure. It's a plan that was unveiled under the previous CEO. So they're kind of trying to sort of do things on multiple fronts and fighting competitive challenges. And I think what's happened under the new boss, Lip-Bu Tan, who took over earlier this year, is he's having to sort of look at non-core assets and think about what he does with them. As I say, this was floated around before he joined last year, that they were thinking of selling this smaller unit called NEX, and it's basically network and edge. And it includes a lot of stuff that doesn't really have much to do with telecom. I mean, the thing that really interests me is a part of that called CSG, Communication Solutions Group, that would do. And when we hear about virtual RAN talked about all the time in the telecom industry at the moment, and they'd certainly be responsible for that. But it goes much wider than that. They actually make a lot of the chips that we've seen used in 5G base station products over the last few years. So the big companies the names we come across when we're talking about 5G RAN sales, a lot of that would have Intel's chips in them. And therefore a sale of that business is quite kind of a dramatic development and also has implications for those players.
Yeah, so let's get into that part of the conversation then. The implications for both Intel and for the various industry players like Ericsson you zeroed in on. So like I said, your piece zeroed in on Intel's decline and also the fact that this move will have, and I'm quoting you here, massive consequences for Intel customers such as Ericsson, which might even emerge as a prospective buyer. So tell me more about what this decision means for both Intel's business overall, which you've kind of touched on, but also the consequences for the Ericssons of the world. And I'm also curious about then why Ericsson would be a prospective buyer here.
So for Intel, the consequences are, I mean, sales-wise, probably not that dramatic. As I say, It's quite a small part of what Intel does. NEX as a whole, I think, was generating I think it's something like $5 billion last year. This is a company that a few years ago was making $70 billion in annual revenues, and that's kind of dropped off. I think quarterly sales at the moment are about $13 billion for the second quarter. So it's a relatively small percentage of what Intel does. And as I say, it goes beyond telecom, the kind of edge enterprise stuff that they would be that would be included in NEX as a part of that as well. It is a non-core asset. I mean, the things Intel's really going to be bothered about, obviously, are the CCG group, client computing group, which to a layperson is PCs, basically,
Mm-hmm.
for PCs. The adverts always used to have that little jingle, I can't remember what it goes like, but I won't try and do it. But they used to have the little jingle about the Pentium processor inside and all this
You're
stuff.
not going to sing it for us?
No, I don't want to go into doing singing on podcasts, not yet. And then the other bit's the data center and AI group. That's the other big bit. So that's the sort of bulk of Intel's business. The foundry unit's kind of separate and a younger thing, obviously, and they're trying to get that going. But
Okay.
I think from an Intel perspective, business wise, it wouldn't be something that would sort of halve the size of Intel or anything like that. I think it's more of a concern for, as you say, the companies that are buying those products from them. And
Yeah.
the reason I single out Ericsson is, the RAN market is not very competitive. It's a few big players really, so
Mm-hmm.
global industry. And this is one of the reasons we've heard about topics like Open RAN and virtual RAN so much in the past, because Open RAN was very much a kind of initiative to try and bring more companies into the market. I think you go back sort of 20, 25 years, there used to be lots of companies selling base station equipment. The UK had Marconi, the US had companies like Motorola and Lucent, and Canada had Nortel. I mean, all these names have now gone. They've kind of gone in waves of consolidation, and we've got this global market that's really like 75% of it. This is figures from Omdia, which is one of our sister companies.
Yeah.
75% of it's basically just three companies. It's Huawei, which is increasingly being kind of squeezed out of Western markets anyway. Ericsson will be the number two, and then Nokia. And I don't think Intel's really had dealings with Huawei. They tend to do their own stuff, but they'd certainly made a big push back in the sort of 2019, 2020 time frame when 5G was coming along, about trying to get into the kind of 5G base station space a lot more. They had this product range that was, I think the code name for it was something like Snow Ridge.
Okay.
The product subsequently got released under the Atom brand, but these were basically chips that do the compute side of the radio access network. They're not really so heavily involved in the radios themselves, but if you look at the bottom of any kind of 5G mast, you find the server equipment, and there'll be Intel chips there that are doing the baseband processing and all that sort of stuff. And they were doing deals with, they called out their customers at the time. I think our former colleague Mike Dano was writing about this. They were citing deals with Nokia, with ZTE even at the time. Back when ZTE was not sort of considered to be someone that you shouldn't be dealing with.
Right.
With
Yeah.
Ericsson, and Ericsson's the reason Ericsson's particularly dependent is I think geopolitics has obviously changed what they can do when it comes to Chinese players anyway. And Nokia has made a bit of a retreat from Intel in the last few years. They had a bit of an upset. I mean, they kind of their first wave of 5G products were not perceived to be very competitive, and it resulted in quite a dramatic loss of market share for Nokia in the sort of 2020 era. And partly that was blamed on Intel and some sort of product problems that were there, product delivery problems to do with these 10 nanometer chips that Intel was supposed to be doing from Nokia. And one of the consequences of that, of Nokia sort of being upset by Intel and having been so heavily reliant on them for their 5G strategy, was them sort of pivoting to other suppliers. So what they did at first was they named two others. They brought Broadcom in, which is very much the kind of radio side, and they brought a company called Marvell Technology in on the baseband side. And what really seems to have happened is that in the later stage products they're doing at the moment, there aren't really any Intel chips at all. They're all sort of ARM based processors in the compute side, and then they're relying on people like Broadcom in the radios. They've really kind of made an effort to sort of move away from Intel, and they've even got a virtual RAN strategy. So when we talk about virtual RAN, that's really about using Intel sort of general purpose chips to do RAN compute rather than something that's purpose built for 5G. Even there, they're trying to make an effort not to be as reliant on Intel, where I think it's harder to do that because it's much more dominant in that small space. Even there, they're trying not to be as reliant on Intel. Whereas Ericsson is almost the opposite. Ericsson seems to be very, very closely entwined, both in its virtual RAN strategy and in its purpose-built strategy. It's very reliant on 5G chips from Intel. So, we don't want to go into the minutiae too much and start talking about layers, but even when they're sort of saying we actually are responsible for our own silicon, they're sort of using Intel for manufacturing expertise. and they're certainly using it. They're kind of buying chips for them for some of the less kind of resource hungry compute tasks as well. And I think that's the reason I think it's a kind of very nervy moment for Ericsson, because if this unit gets offered up and sold, then they've got this such a close relationship with Intel, and have had that over the last few years, that they don't really know what might happen to the products after that. And I can speculate about one scenario, which is someone like Broadcom, let's say, coming along and buying that business. And Broadcom's got a bit of a reputation for kind of raising prices when they've made acquisitions. A lot of that comes from the VMware developments, where that's what seems to have happened. And maybe, I mean, that's something that would make Ericsson, I think, very nervous. It's just the idea of it falling under the control of somebody that maybe they don't have the same kind of partnership with, and maybe they're concerned about pricing implications and the technology roadmap. So, and I think this is why Ericsson's been named as a potential buyer. And that was a rumor that I heard from sources sort of last year, that it had actually been offered up to Ericsson and other companies at the time.
Oh, okay. Has Ericsson had the occasion to chime in on this since this rumor was confirmed?
They have not. When I've asked them about it, they've not commented. And
Okay.
and as I say, I did ask them about it earlier this year, I think,
Yeah.
when they had a different person who was responsible for the RAN business, a guy called Frederick Yedling, who's now left and been replaced by Per Narvinger. But I think all you'll really get from them is you'll certainly not get any kind of. I mean, I don't know. It's something that probably needs to be monitored all the time. And over the next few weeks, I'll probably be maybe trying to poke Ericsson a little bit on what's going on here, and do they have an interest in it. But I think a few months ago, the line that you get from Ericsson was that they sort of would say that they would make themselves out to be not as reliant on Intel as I'm suggesting they are.
Okay.
One thing. And then I think they'd also sort of position their RAN strategy in the moment as one where they're trying to develop their software so that they're not too tied to one particular hardware platform. And this is where you get virtualization coming into it, I guess, is this sort of future vision of RAN software that could basically be put on any underlying processor, whether it's an x86 one or whether it's something that's ARM based from NVIDIA, let's say. And you don't really need to make huge changes to do that. It's hardware independent. They've talked that up a lot in the past.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is that they then come out with white papers saying we're still kind of heavily reliant on x86, and it's quite hard to move to other platforms. There's energy issues. So yeah.
Okay. So that takes us neatly into our final bucket here, which is, the what's next of it all. Obviously, as you mentioned, you're going to be following up with Ericsson to get them to say something substantial on this. What other open questions do you have, and what else are you going to be looking for over the coming weeks and months on this topic?
Yeah, so I think the key one is Ericsson interested in doing this, and I think the issue for me is I think it's a really hard thing to pull off, is to spin off NEX, and maybe that's why they didn't get expressions of interest last year when I heard that it was actually being offered around. I mean, this is kind of a formal acknowledgement. I should say, actually, full credit to other titles, because it's nice to name publications when they get. This wasn't me. I kind of did a story on it that looked at the implications and tried to analyze it, but the actual scoop came from a publication called CRN.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only reason Intel's actually acknowledged it and come out with a statement saying, yes, we are spinning NEX off, was because CRN had got hold of an internal company memo.
Yeah. Well, we'll link to both your story and CRN's initial reporting.
Yeah, and so they didn't really have a choice. They sort of once there's a memo out there, they kind of have to admit that they're doing it. But it sounds like they've been trying to do this for a long time. And the memo, the statement that I got from Intel, sort of implied that what they want to do is something similar to what they've done with Altera.
Okay.
Which is the kind of custom chip business they spun off. So if you look at what Altera is now, it's separate from Intel, and it's majority owned by private equity, but Intel still has a 49% stake. So I think they could potentially, and I think will still want to have an ownership stake in it. It's not as though the whole thing's going to be taken over. But if we look at what they did with Altera, then it could have another majority owner, another company sort of in control of it. And I think it's a difficult thing to do, partly because the RAN market just isn't very attractive at the moment.
Right.
like revenues were down. Product revenues were down, according to Omdia, by 5 billion last year. It's like a 12.5% drop. And they'd fallen the year before that, 2023, by about the same amount. So you're talking about $10 billion in annual revenues coming off a $45 billion figure in 2022. It's a huge drop. So it's not been a very attractive market to be in. And I think a lot of the push with Open RAN, which people would have hoped would bring new companies in, and maybe they had a rosier vision of the next few years at the time, just hasn't really worked out. So you're still looking at a fairly small number of companies that you're selling to. You can't serve Huawei anymore because of geopolitics. It's really only Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung's the only other one, and they've got a relatively small part of the market. They're bigger in North America than they are in certain other regions, but it's a small number of companies, and the revenues at those companies just haven't been growing. Telcos haven't been spending as much on radio access network equipment as they were doing. So it's a bit of a hard sell anyway, I think, to investors. And then I think the other concern is, how do you separate that unit when it's sort of tied to x80, the x86 technology that's at the heart of Intel, is what sort of feeds these other parts, the CCG, the data center and AI group, and the various component parts of NEX. So how do you kind of take that outside and put it with somebody else? It's still going to be using x86 technology, so there still has to be that kind of connection to the bigger Intel, some kind of licensing arrangement. I just don't see how it exists as an independent thing and carries on developing x86 on its own, if you see what I mean. It's quite a hard thing to envisage happening, and I don't know how that would work. And then the problem with someone like Ericsson buying it, and this is why maybe they wouldn't even be allowed to buy it, is that it obviously does, even though Ericsson is probably the biggest customer of the client sort of the communication solutions group, it does serve other companies. I mean, Samsung is very, very heavily reliant on Intel products for their virtual RAN rollout. If you look at Verizon's network in the US, that's all Samsung and Intel chips, basically, those base stations where Samsung's the vendor. So how does that work? It's almost like when Nvidia was trying to buy ARM, if you remember, a few years ago, and they were blocked from doing it because they were a licensee of ARM. So they'd be owning it and they'd be licensing the technology to competitors of theirs.
Right. So then maybe like an investment group or something would make more sense as a buyer here.
So. I think almost what's happened with Altera would make more sense for a private equity group to come in and maybe try and do something with it, because I just feel that a regulator who's looking at this sensibly would go, well, it can't possibly be Ericsson owning it, because Samsung's a customer of it, and you can't, if Ericsson buys that and views that as these are chips we're going to develop for our own products, we'll try and sell the same. It just doesn't compute. So I think there's all these issues that need to be kind of looked at in terms of what happens. And, as you say, those are the sorts of things that we kind of need to sort of keep prodding at and poking away at and asking questions about, I guess, over the next few weeks. But it's nice the story's out. At least they've sort of acknowledged that it's happening. And it's an interesting one to watch.
Now you can start asking all of the follow-up interesting questions. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through this. We will obviously be keeping up with your great reporting on this and everything else going forward, and looking forward to having you back.
Thanks, Nicole.